And this insane fact of knowing that, 6.7 lakh crore could have been saved by investing 5 crores, which is what the Climate Risk Atlas actually costs.
You are listening to Understanding the Future podcast. I am the host Punit Gandhi, and this podcast is developed in association with Climate Center for Cities under the National Institute of Urban Affairs and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. This is a podcast where we discuss about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, innovation, and sustainability with the help of leaders and visionaries working on ground as well as in the top management of public and private sector. Our objective is to better understand the future so that we can be prepared and intervene to enable climate actions in the urban areas.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast Understanding the Future. I'm the host Punit Gandhi, and today we have with us Amita Ramachandran. She is the COO of India Climate Collaborative, and she will help us in understanding the future of philanthropy and climate change. Welcome to the show, Amita.
Thank you so much, Puneet. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so because we are talking about philanthropy, so let's start with very basic. Like my understanding of philanthropy somewhere that it helps in developing research or implementation of some kind of socially important projects and which are not too financially feasible or in advocacy of some kind of policy. So, am I missing out on something, or am I right about it? Can you help us understand objective of philanthropy in a better way?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're pretty close to the mark. I think a useful way to start thinking about philanthropy always is, just from the word itself and the meaning of the word itself. Philanthropy means for the love of humanity. I don't know if you know that. And though it's changed a lot over time, and I think we see it changing a lot, especially in recent years, it's really not a new instinct for people. There is evidence for philanthropy and charitable giving that dates back really as long as humans have been able to accumulate wealth. And it's played a really important role in shaping the society that we live in today. I think one of the best examples of that is the philanthropy that founded and incubated the India Climate Collaborative, which is the Tata Trust. I don't know how many people know this, but the Tata Trust is almost 127 or 28 years old. It is a foundation that predates Indian independence, and some of the most remarkable things that I think it did was invest in building, legacy institutions, things that in normal times I think we would expect governments to build, right? Hospitals, universities, research institutes, many of them that last until today. I really think that those sort of investments in that institution building is the hallmark of what philanthropy can do to support both government and civil society. And that's really where we believe the power of philanthropy is, right? It's that sort of third rung between private sector, public sector, and the public. And it's a really important societal tool that I think, allows the public to be a shaper of society just the way that businesses and policymakers are, because it can be complementary in the ways that I mentioned that the Tata Trust were when they started out 127 years ago. But they also do invest a lot in what doesn't get covered between the main shapers, the private sector and the public sector. And in many ways, it can also hold a mirror up to those two rungs, right? And hold accountability to them and put things that are important to the public or that are important to the welfare of the public, put them back on the map and put them quite firmly back on the map. I think the interesting thing about that role that it plays is that it can make it quite controversial. And I think in recent years, we've seen a little bit more criticism of philanthropy because they, what right do we have to give them that place in our society, right? And I think one of the most interesting examples I've read about recently is the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, Mike Zuckerberg's philanthropy, where of course he's accumulated so much of this wealth from creating Facebook, and so much of their philanthropy is going towards education reform in the United States. And a lot of people ask this question of, what gives him the right, what gives him the qualifications or the experience to be able to do that? Nothing really, other than the fact that he has a massive amount of money and that's where he's chosen to give his money. The other, maybe slightly different example is, Bill Gates. And I think
Yeah,
for everybody in the development sector, the Gates Foundation, we can widely agree, has done more good for global society than bad.
yeah,
And still, when you think about, how much power that has given Bill Gates, where nowadays in global convenings, he gets to go and step on stage with all these state leaders from across the world. The interesting thing there is that all those state leaders are elected representatives who elected Bill Gates and who gets the chance to elect him out of office if we don't like what he's doing anymore. So those are some of the tricky things that we also have to contend with in philanthropy, but there's no denying that it plays a really critical role. And like I said, it's been a huge part of shaping the society that we live in today, and that's why the ICC was founded by and is focused on Indian and international philanthropies working on climate change.
Absolutely, I agree with it, and that is where one of the major thing also comes that we are interested and we also look towards is the future aspect, because philanthropy, every money in philanthropy is being invested for the future. We are
Mm-hmm.
not investing something that okay, this is the direct return today. So if you are talking about research, a lot of philanthropy money is going into research which might not even be feasible, which might not even make it to on ground. It is just something
Mm-hmm.
that's been funded over there, and that's it. Either if it succeeds. If not, it does not. So
Yeah.
there is a lot of risk taking in that kind of investment, which I guess no government can take. So private sector does not bring up. But so how does that function in world and Indian context? How do we see that kind of risk taking, and what all kind of risk taking in philanthropy we are talking about in world and Indian context?
It's an interesting question because I would say that the domestic philanthropic market, even though it's old, like I said, it
Yeah,
is relatively new and new in its thinking in India.
yeah,
I do actually see that in our experience of working with Indian philanthropies, there's a much larger skew towards favoring, on ground immediate outcomes over the longer term sort of systemic change, even sometimes a bias away from funding research. There is this sort of incentive to that, in India, we have so many populations with very immediate needs, and that the mandate for philanthropy is to serve those immediate needs. And
yeah,
sometimes that can be at the expense of making some of the broader, sweeping, systemic changes that can actually have lasting change. And of course, that's a generalization. Not all philanthropy does that, but I think with the younger philanthropies, that's usually how the thinking behind what to give to even begins. Right? You hear the stories of somebody, sees an ill person or has a family member who falls ill from a particular illness, and therefore that evokes a certain commitment to funding research to find a cure.
yeah,
Or you see a particular community outside your gate and you feel very moved by the fact that they don't have access to clean water, and therefore you decide that that's going to be the sort of goal of the work that you do. A lot of philanthropy still is very intuition motivated in that way. And I think
yeah,
that makes sense. Again, if you go back to what the definition of philanthropy actually is, it is for the love of humanity. But I think one of the flaws of that sort of thinking is that, the primary form of concessional capital that has the ability to be risk taking and the power to be risk taking isn't actually doing too much of that at this time. But I do think that the domestic philanthropic market is changing significantly. We see it increasing in quantum significantly. I think it's increased. Family foundation giving has increased almost 15% between 2014 and 2018. I think CSR is going up even more. So I do think there's some trends there that are really encouraging, that show a different future. I think that the reality that we exist in right now is that quite a lot of funding goes towards the most sort of basic development outcomes. I think about 60% of philanthropy goes towards health and education outcomes. Over 60% of philanthropic funding actually goes to three states: Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh. So you also see that skew in geography. And sometimes that's really linked to, how many credible and credible nonprofits do you have there? How many nonprofits do you have that have enough visibility that you would even know about them, and therefore you would think to give to them? So it's skewed by basically public awareness, and those are some of the things that we at the ICC are trying to shift by making sure that the really innovative, the really powerful solutions are the ones that are getting to the funders and are getting to the public attention. We think there's a lot more out there, and sometimes that can actually be the theory of change, right? That you don't decide to give money and then find good solutions, that you see a really good solution and it actually makes you decide you want to give, or give more than you were giving, or give differently than you were giving before. So yeah, I think that the field of philanthropy is changing rapidly, and that makes it a really exciting place to be.
Yeah, that's a very interesting statistics, because not being in the market, we are not aware of this kind of skewed perspective of a lot of things that comes up into picture, and how
Mm-hmm.
ICC is trying to deal with it. So coming to ICC and how climate change is being dealt over here, because that is something that your organization and my organization, or at least my Climate Center for Cities, with whom I
Mm-hmm.
work, is trying to do and make a dent on those lines. And so how is ICC trying to, change that narrative, change that kind of funding in this space? It is just mitigation, is it adaptation? How are we trying to balance it out?
Yeah, I actually think the best way to start by talking about the ICC is actually to start by talking about how and why we were built. So 3 years ago, I actually joined the Data Trust sustainability team. And like I said, the Data Trust is 127 years old, but our sustainability team was brand new. It was just being
Yeah,
set up. We were a two-person team. And like most philanthropic portfolios, you start out by doing a little bit of a scoping. You figure out what are some of the gaps in the ecosystem, where other philanthropy is funding, and what are some of the areas where, then the Data Trust can play a unique role and play a kind of catalytic role. So we did all that work, and we started looking at the sector and realized, it really was one big gap. I mean, there was nobody else out there. There was no domestic philanthropy really doing any significant work on. And of course, there's some examples of the work that existed, but at that point, just 3 years ago, it was really minuscule. Global estimates of how much of philanthropy go towards climate change are less than 2%. And in India, the total quantum of philanthropic giving is much smaller. And I'm pretty sure, though we don't have enough data to really know this, that the percentage in India would even be lower. And so it became this question of, okay, we have one option, which is to be the first, set up this portfolio, really makes a case to the trustees why we need to do this, and fund a series of projects that we think can have, great impact. And also, in a way, you can think about it as having outsized impact, right? Because we're the first ones really putting money into this field and encouraging this
yeah,
action. But there was also this larger mandate and responsibility, which is, the Data Trust has credibility, it has convening power, it has an ability to bring people along with them. And we know that an issue like climate change it's too big, it's too systemic, it's too urgent for any one actor to do alone. It just didn't make sense for us to think that by creating a portfolio within one philanthropy, no matter how big or how small, that we would really be able to move the needle on this issue. And it
yeah,
became sort of our mandate that if we were going to do this work, if we were going to landscape the ecosystem, figure out where the funding is really needed, that we needed to bring people along with us and use some of the resources we had available, like the backing of the trust, like the convening power, all of those things to try and encourage other people to join us. So that was really the start of the ICC, which is realizing
yeah,
this major challenge we have ahead of us, and so little support or peers to go at it with. And we were built as a collaborative, and I think the collaboration part of it is a really key piece of not only our goal where we were working towards, but also a founding principle. In many ways, right from the beginning, we decided that we can't just be, the big brother bringing a lot of other philanthropies with us. We have to be co-creating, and we have to get a lot of other people to come together and tell us why haven't they funded climate change already? What are some of the barriers that they're facing? Because everybody knew it was an issue. It was just that there was a series of entry barriers that people would talk about, not having enough expertise within their foundations, not knowing what the organizations they could support to do that kind of work are, fundamentally not understanding what the challenge was and therefore how they could tackle it. So we brought some of these organizations together who we knew were very committed and wanted to do something and wanted to learn together. And together we co-created the mandate, the agenda, and the structure of the ICC by bringing together these Indian and international philanthropies. And the common thing there really was this belief in the power that philanthropy has to play to convene government, business, civil society, and really create cross-sectoral catalytic change, right? So it was a way to de-risk it, to bring other people along with us by saying it's not just you alone, we're all doing this together, but also to break silos. We knew that there was a lot of work happening all over this vast and diverse country. And sometimes there is a lot of reinventing the wheel because not enough people are connected with each other. Not enough people realize other people are struggling with the same issues. There's a lot of redundancies and therefore wasted spending, like you said, research that gets created and it just sits within your organization when many other people could actually use it.
Yeah.
And also a way of sharing responsibility, right? That we all have this responsibility together and we all have the power to do something together. Most importantly, I think collaboration was a way to achieve scale. Again, it's just too big of an issue, this great intangible that is climate change, for one person to try and take on alone. So that was sort of what created us. This group of philanthropies continues to be a guiding and an advisory force for the ICC to ensure that we're staying true to our mandate to represent the philanthropic ecosystem and do what's best for the philanthropies that are our members. And the goals of the ICC, and actually maybe I'll even just say that the ICC was launched only earlier this year. It's been less than 12 months. In January of 2020, we are now the largest philanthropic collaborative in India and the only one focused on combating climate change. We now have over 20 leading Indian and international philanthropists and business leaders who we count as our members, which includes Ratan Tata, Rohini Nilekani, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Hewlett Foundation, and many, many others. And our goal is to seek to drive funding and visibility into the climate ecosystem, which we do in partnership with over 50 civil society organizations, including universities, think tanks, implementing organizations, and actually state and national government bodies. So that's sort of where the ICC is right now. To give you a little bit about what we try to do, our goals are, we broadly talk about them in three ways, which is inspire, connect, and empower. These goals really reflect the broad vision we have for the levers that we think are gaps in the ecosystem right now. So inspire is about, communications, like you said, about narrative building, about movement building. Connect is about the power of networks and building those efficiencies within the fantastic ecosystem that already exists, even if it's small. And empower is about, the informed learning to action journey. So sort of investing in that training and capacity building, whether it's in governments or in think tanks, investing in funding knowledge gaps that exist that we know are preventing, more bold action. All of that sort of work falls into the third one. And this community of partners that we have with us, over 50, like I said, are all organizations that bring immense expertise to us. And we've taken great pains to make sure that they represent the real climate ecosystem, right? So we don't just want the research community. We don't just want the implementing community. We know there are gaps even between those two communities where they don't speak to each other enough, and not enough of our on-ground work is representative of the research, and our research doesn't take into account the on-ground realities around the country. So this was an important part of why we were built the way that we were built. And we try to do our work across two areas. One is, like I said, on engaging more philanthropies to come into the climate space. We try to create that enabling environment for philanthropies to try and demonstrate value for climate investment. So not just the why of climate, why is it important, why is it necessary, but also the how, by providing access to opportunities, connections, knowledge, capacity, all of the things that they said were gaps in funding climate, and try and demonstrate the highest impact ways to invest in climate action. And then there's also a bit of a chicken and the egg, which I'm sure you know
Yeah.
about, just that because there's not enough funding that goes into the ecosystem is small. It doesn't have enough capacity to really be able to deliver on this big, action that we need across mitigation and adaptation. So
Yeah.
with the resources that we have, we try and channel and direct funding towards solving some sectoral challenges that move us collectively towards an ecosystem that can, make and deliver on really big bets for a safer India tomorrow. And I can talk a little bit about the programs we do, but I'm going to stop there because I just talked for quite a bit.
No, no, we will surely come to the programs as well, because I think that is where the crux of anything starts coming into picture as well, that how things are moving forward. Before we do that, one or two more questions on the line, that how much are we looking at? So as philanthropy, there are 20 leading institutions and 50 implementation partners, or 50
Mm.
partners, research and implementation partners. What is the kind of quantum that we are looking at in terms of focused approaches being given to climate change? Quantum of money or quantum of resources, however we can put it.
So this one is a particularly tricky question, I think, because, especially in the US and in Europe, there are mandates that require private philanthropies to publicly show how much they give in a year.
Yeah.
That doesn't actually exist for family foundations in India. Many of them
Okay.
do anyway, but a lot of them
Yeah.
don't. So actually, one of the big challenges that we've been trying to figure out is how do we build enough trust in the philanthropic ecosystem to get to a point where we can start to actually ask people to share that data with us. We
Yeah.
know that it's really critical for us to be able to see the impact that we've had, but also to see the gap that still exists, right? For us to be able to meet that level of investment we need to really make transformational change. So it's a great question. My short answer is that we actually don't know yet. There isn't enough
Okay.
data for me to give you a good answer. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but I can understand that, because this is something which is complex in itself. It's not too. It has its own opacity as well that comes
Mm-hmm.
with, and that is it. So the next thing I would like to shift is towards the collaborations and breaking of silos, because when we are working with so many organizations, as a government organization, we also face this issue. We also face how do we break these silos so that more and more conversations can happen and transfer of knowledge can happen. How is that thing being brought into the system with ICC?
Um, it's tough. It's tough work. I think one way, which is a very low tech way and requires a
Yeah.
lot of capacity, is that we spend as a team, as a small team, we spend a lot of our time on calls or in meetings with our partners, and we
Yeah.
use that. I think it's important, right? There's no simple way of doing this, which is keeping in
Yeah.
touch with the ecosystem that really drives us, right? That the ecosystem that we're trying to support. So we try to use every single conversation to continue to update that sort of landscape mapping that we did when we first started out. Make sure that we're constantly revalidating those hypotheses, which is, are these issues that we started out trying to solve, are they still the right issues? Are we still focusing on the right things? Or is the community and the ecosystem actually telling us that there's a completely different opportunity here, or that we're completely missing something, or that we're doing something wrong? So it's our way of constantly getting feedback about what our role should be, and what we're working towards. And we've developed some good ways of being able to track that internally and share that knowledge across even our organization, but also across all of the philanthropies that are members to us. So we use these quarterly meetings with all of our funders to give them an update not only on what we're doing, but also to say, this is what we're hearing from the entire ecosystem. And we feel like that's one of the privileges that we have for being a collaborative, right? And having
Yeah.
the vantage point that we do have is that a lot of people know that we can be that honest broker, that third party
Yeah.
that's thinking about solving sector problems and not just, each individual problems or geographic problems. We're really invested in supporting the community at large. And I think that's gotten us a lot of great advisors because people recognize how important that role is, right? And that it's a
Yeah.
challenging role. It requires convincing a lot of people constantly about why this work is important, so that the think tanks and the implementing organizations don't have to do that, because it is a real it's a drain to be able to speak to somebody who doesn't understand the major challenges. And I think that's something we've been able to do quite well, is to be able to communicate those challenges effectively to an audience that maybe is starting from complete scratch, doesn't know anything about climate change. How do you
Yeah.
make them feel like it's not such a technical issue, which I think globally it has become, right? People feel like it's inaccessible because it's too technical, it's too scientific. What role can I really play? It's a doom and gloom story. We really try to flip that in how we communicate about climate change. We talk about the opportunity to really transform and reimagine, the future, and reimagine our development to truly be sustainable. And I think that's been one of the things that got us support right from the beginning, is this ability to communicate that there's no pathway to sustainable development for India anymore that doesn't factor climate change in. Whether we're proactive about it or reactive about it, we're going to have to face it at some point. We already are.
Yeah.
So why not do it together? Why not be opportunistic about it and try and use this systemic change to create a nation that we feel is much better for all of the people who live in it, and protect especially the most vulnerable. We try and use that sort of optimistic lens, and I think that's a power that philanthropy has. Our
Yeah.
currency is compassion. It's caring about people, so that connects really well with the audiences that we work with.
Yeah, it is important because until and unless we can bring that on the table, compassion is on the table. I don't think so it will be effective. Otherwise, we will
Mhm.
still keep on chasing numbers which might not be relevant at certain points. Uh,
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's one of the most stark learnings about the climate movement globally in the past decade, which is that we keep, and we still see it today, we keep thinking that if only we had enough evidence, everybody would understand what we're talking about and change their
yeah,
mind. And we just have to wake up and realize that it actually doesn't move people. Evidence doesn't move people. Methods and reasons and climate models, it doesn't fundamentally change the way that people think or how motivated they feel to be part of this conversation. We
yeah,
really need to flip that on its head and find a completely new way to communicate, where you appeal to the things that matter to people, right? At the end of the day, humans are
yeah,
self-interested. You have to find those things that matter to them and connect climate to that. And thankfully, climate is so all pervasive. It's not hard. It does connect
yeah,
to every single thing that matters to every single human. But stepping out of, this is what matters to me, to figure out this is what matters to the person I'm speaking to, and I need to appeal to that to get them to understand why this is important. That
yeah.
is like at the core, I think, of the new climate work for the next decade.
Yeah, it's a fundamental human behavior change that we are also asking eventually, that
Mm-hmm.
whatever you have been doing has been not wrong per se, but there are some problems to it or some minor things that you can always change. So that I think is a quite complex topic when we are dealing with it. It's a more systemic and fundamental issue than just scientific and technical. And once we get out of that box, that is when we realize that okay, things need to be changed in a much drastic way than what we have thought about. Coming to ICC again, and what are the different programs that are being run under ICC right now? Projects that are functioning under ICC.
Yeah. So we have chosen four program areas that have started this year. And the criteria for choosing them is primarily two factors. How relevant is it to the work of the Indian philanthropic community, especially to Indian jobs and Indian livelihoods, which we know is of national importance at this time. And the second, of course, is potential for impact on climate change, which is both on adaptation and mitigation. We're very clear that the India climate story has to be about both, right? We can't just prioritize one or the other. Then we need to find a way to walk that line. And so the four areas that we have launched programs under are air quality, water security, sustainable land use, and clean energy. Within that, you basically have everything you need, but it really felt like those were the articulation of those actually took a very long time for us. We were like, how high, how detailed do we go? Do we call it land use? Do we call it agroforestry.
Yeah.
And we realized that the bigger framing we can have it, the bigger tent our work can be, right? We can invite more people in it because they won't feel like they can't relate to the maybe technical terms that we're using or that we focus too narrowly on one thing. And that was really the reason why we've kept it somewhat, broad. And there is a layer that builds underneath all of these, which is our kind of foundational climate work. We haven't found a better term to call it, but it really is the work of sort of building that base understanding of climate change, literally climate 101,
Yeah.
and understanding, the difference between mitigation and adaptation, which might seem easy to you and me and really isn't that commonplace for most people.
Yeah.
And also an understanding of what are some of the events, the ongoing policy changes and events that we see that we can break down for the audience that we have, that otherwise it's hard to find kind of a nuanced view on how this, I can give you an example of the environmental impact assessment, which was hugely controversial this year. We knew that there were two sides to that conversation, and that we were seeing a very polarized conversation in the media. So we made an effort to, as part of our foundational climate work, bring our philanthropy as corporate leaders together and have a briefing about the changes to the EIA, get some environmental activists in the room, also get some representatives from the NIUFCC, and have a fair conversation, a conversation that accepts that there is nuance to these decisions. We're not trying to be an activist body, but we do want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to hear both sides. So through that work, we're trying to make sure that high quality information, perspectives on what's going on, and an ability to understand the actions that somebody can take is accessible to everybody within our community. And that's sort of what the foundational climate work is.
Okay. So are we then specifically looking more on lines of, if I can understand, mapping of the whole ecosystem to start off, and then more of
Mm-hmm.
things will be developed in this association so that, okay, this is what is required in each of these sector, because yes, all these sectors are important and inherent to climate change, because this is
Yeah.
what is affected for us. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming that this is how, once the mapping is done, it will be then taken for the step will be taken forward accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have done many informal mappings, like I said, and that we keep trying to update. One of the things that we're kicking off in 2021 is actually a formal climate ecosystem mapping, which will be a public resource. It'll be hosted, on our website, and also hosted on our partners' website, which is Ashoka, the Social Innovators for
Yeah.
Public. We're really excited to partner with them because they globally have this sort of trademarked way of doing network mappings. They use a sort of snowball method, which is very grassroots, and it basically involves reaching out to climate leaders and then interviewing them, getting their perspective on what are gaps in the space, what are strengths of the Indian climate community, and then asking them to nominate 5 other climate leaders, and basically
Yeah.
trying to cover the entire extensive mapping of the ecosystem, and then step back and be able to look at that mapping and see, okay, where are the crowded areas where there's actually like too many people, and where are some of the areas where we expected, if we look at our emissions map, or we look at where some of the critical areas for India's climate adaptation should be, where are some areas where there actually are no organizations, no leaders, and then use that to direct more attention and funding towards building capacity within those areas. I think the exciting thing about partnering with Ashoka, who are globally reputed, is that this is coming from their commitment to having more climate social innovation leaders. So for them, this mapping is also a way to be able to identify who all the climate innovation leaders are, and then use their resources to support them in building capacity, which we know that in across the development ecosystem is something we really face as a challenge, right? The capacity to be able to build organizations and scale up really successful organizations. We do often find that once all NGOs reach a certain size, they really start to struggle with some of the issues of scale. And I think there are great organizations that support them in that. That's a non-climate, agnostic issue that can, where significant capacity building can be built. So that's the sort of Ashoka mapping. I think if I go into each program, you will be here forever, Puneet. So I'll give you one example of a program that I think is quite an interesting one. It's a good example both of the topic of this podcast, which is the role that philanthropy can play, and also critical gaps in the climate ecosystem that we're trying to fill. So like we've talked about, our conversations in climate change globally, especially, are usually skewed towards combating climate change and basically climate mitigation, right? And the reality is that in India, especially, climate change is already happening. Many of us are already experiencing those effects, whether we know to call it climate change or not. There's an interesting statistic by the United Nations Interagency Standing Committee report where they talk. It's a report on return on investment in emergency preparedness, and they say that for every 75 rupees that's invested in climate preparedness, it saves over 150 rupees in future response. And if you extrapolate that ratio to India's losses, which have been estimated to be about 13 lakh crore on disaster management in the past 20 years, you can safely estimate that the government could have saved close to 6.7 lakh crore, which is about 89 billion US dollars, if such systems for disaster preparedness were in place. And in addition to saving lives and livelihoods, that savings is also at an economy level could have been directed to much more productive economic activities. We're just not at the level yet where we are prepared for those sort of risks. They sort of happen to us. We've seen it happen this year, especially with all the cyclones on the east and the west coast. We get a few days notice and then they happen and they really destroy livelihoods and they cost a huge amount of public spending that can be avoided. Our vision, of course, is to create a future, and that's something I'm sure we share with you, create a future where we are able to minimize that impact and minimize it especially for vulnerable communities, but also for infrastructure and for institutions that we know a warming India will really impact. And the main way that we see an ability to do this is by mainstreaming climate risk assessment. It really has to be adopted by every business, by every government body, and factored into all kinds of planning, right? They have to see the value in it for themselves. And they have to, and of course they will, because it's a matter of protecting lives and avoiding destruction. And right now we're currently lacking that data, and actually not as much about the data, but we're lacking it in a packaging that is accessible to the people who actually need to use it, right? Useful to the right people in a way that makes sense, that's compelling, that convinces people to actually start to use it in planning. It's a big overall systems gap in climate communications at large, like we just talked about, but also in this specific area. So to tackle this for Indian climate risks, the ICC is partnering with the Council for Energy, Environment and Water, I'm sure you know, think tank in India, to develop a comprehensive climate risk atlas. That's what the program is called. The climate risk atlas will be designed, around this concept of what we can measure, we can manage, or at least try to manage. Yep. And this insane fact of knowing that 6.7 lakh crore could have been saved by investing 5 crores, which is what the climate risk atlas actually costs, it's mind-boggling, right? This is exactly the kind of role that philanthropy can play. The ICC is not. Yep. We're only funding part of this. There is still actually some of it that needs to be co-funded. But these are the kinds of catalytic investments that philanthropy can make that have outsized impact, right? You're talking about just a magnitude of difference in investment and the impact that you can have. And by funding this knowledge gap and using the sort of interesting resources that philanthropies have, like our credibility, our connections to government, right? The trust that people have in that we're doing this work for the right reasons, you can make sure to get that knowledge piece to the right government representatives. You can fund training to make sure that it's actually usable and edited to make sure that it's accessible to the right people, and basically ensure uptake. And eventually the idea is that this piece will be owned completely by government bodies like the NDMA, etc. And that's a goal that we're pretty confident will happen because of the immense benefits we know it will have. But sometimes it takes, a philanthropic body that sees that potential to invest and sort of kickstart that project. Kickstart that change. And specifically about the piece that we're funding, it'll be a district compendium, a section of this larger risk atlas, which will have a sector-wise vulnerability assessment for Indian districts, and an index that sort of highlights the most vulnerable districts in India and what they are most vulnerable to, including extreme weather events, coastal flooding, urban heat stress, water stress, crop loss, vector-borne diseases, biodiversity collapse, all of the things that are relevant in India.
Yeah.
So that's a one deep example of a program that we're running.
Thank you. That was indeed quite insightful because once we get into this, I'm sure like if I had more time, I would have asked you many more questions on these lines.
We
But
can talk
as
about it after the podcast. I'm happy to, Puneet.
Absolutely. So coming, I'll again step back on what all conversations we are having and look at it again from a larger lens. That when we are talking about philanthropy and how do we look at its future now? How do we? So there is also a lot of buzz going about individual giving and how does that come into picture? How do we look at philanthropy maybe 10 years down the line? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm pretty sure that what we'll see is a rapid, professionalization of the philanthropic and the development sector. And there's a few key things that I think we'll see within that. I think one is a willingness to invest more in institutions and not in programs. I think we're starting to see this already. That there's a hesitation that everybody feels about paying for somebody's salary or even paying for a high quality talent salary, which means that sometimes we are not attracting the best talent, right? And the development sector is not competitive with the private sector. I see that changing because people are seeing the value of having really well trained people solving some of our greatest challenges, right? It makes sense that we would hire that kind of talent. So I also see better paid professionals working in the sector and attracting better talent to the sector, which I think will have a huge impact. I think at a larger level, I think we're going to start seeing more strategic, not charitable giving. So going from that sort of intuition-based philanthropy to thinking about questions like, moving away from the sort of incremental efforts that we have right now, which are really important, but thinking more long-term about, if we think about let's say 2050, what do we want our nation to look like? What do we want our energy and economic systems to look like? And then how can philanthropy create that momentum to make that transition happen? I think those conversations are going to drive more of the decisions that philanthropic giving makes. And another big thing, and maybe this is hopeful because we are the India Climate Collaborative, I do see a lot more collaboration. I think people are starting to see that the benefits largely outweigh the costs of, the transaction costs of coordinating with a lot of people and trying to build consensus and trying to find alignment. I think people see the significant transformational, systemic, national impact you can have when you work together. And I'm very hopeful that that's the sort of future that we're working towards within the philanthropic sector.
Yeah, that does sound more optimistic, and I hope that does come true as well because we do need more and more professionals working in development sector as well on these lines, and it's just a need of the hour, I feel, than anything else. And based on that, coming to the last question is on the lines of what are the different skills you feel are important to be in the sector of philanthropy that anyone can have?
I get asked this question a lot, and it's actually a tricky one because I feel like we need everything. I think, and especially because I know that the audience for this podcast are young people who might be thinking about how to fit in.
Yeah,
I know that there's a lot of people who worry that they can't get involved because they don't come from a climate background, and I didn't come from a climate background, but I know that there's a special lens that I can put on this communication barrier that we were talking about, right? How
yeah,
to think beyond just the research, because I know that I don't come from that research background. I just have to put that person that I'm speaking to in my shoes and say, would I
yeah,
have listened to this if I was sitting on the other side of the table? If not, then I have to find a different way of communicating. And it's helpful for me with my background in the development sector to appeal to the interests of the philanthropic community. We need that sort of understanding of how to put yourself in the shoes of all stakeholders that make important decisions that make a difference on climate, whether that's in businesses, whether that's in government, or whether that's in the development sector, or even in your community, to use that skill, that understanding to be able to make climate part of every single conversation. That's really the only way that I see us being able to tackle this huge problem is if everybody makes it their own. And that's going to require everybody coming with all of their unique skills and trying to figure out how to apply it to the problem. And I promise you that there is a way. So
Yeah.
if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to speak to anybody who's interested in figuring that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Amita. I think this was a wonderful for me to understand how philanthropy comes into picture and what it does. If I have missed out on anything and you would like to cover it, please go ahead.
The last thing that maybe I want to end on is that
Yeah,
I read actually last year a great quote by Bill McKibben, who I'm sure you know, a climate action icon.
yeah,
He once wrote that if you're younger than 60, you have a good chance of witnessing a significant destabilization of life on Earth as you know it. You know, massive crop failures, apocalyptic fires, imploding economies. I think he said epic flooding, climate migrants, all of this stuff, and regions that are just becoming uninhabitable because of extreme heat or permanent drought. And if you're under 30, which I am, you're all but guaranteed to witness that. And in one way, that's a doom and gloom climate story, which we do try and stay away from. But in another, I think it's really an invitation to reimagine our future to be better for everybody, right? To be more equitable, to be more livable. And there's still a chance to join in. This is the start of the decisive decade where we really start to make these changes. We need everybody to be involved in shaping this future, and we can only do it when everybody joins in. So just reiterating my last part, when climate becomes a part of everybody's mental models, this is how we really solve the problem. So that's what I want to end on. The last thing I want to say is thank you, Puneet, for having me and having the ICC on this show. I actually listened to a couple of podcasts, so I was a couple of your podcasts while I was preparing for this, and I'm so impressed in every podcast how you're able to get into each separate subject in such a deep way and ask such thoughtful questions. So I've been really lucky to be on here, and thank you for having us.
Thank you, Amita. It is my pleasure as well that ICC and you could come on board because eventually the idea is to understand this in all different perspectives possible. I think that is when we can start building upon what we are trying to build, either climate, innovation, sustainability, or urban development. These are all very complicated topics just to be done by one person. They require
Absolutely.
a massive amount of workforce. So thanks a
Well,
lot
you're
for your
doing a
time.
fantastic job.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. And thank you for being on our show. I really hope that audience also feels the same way and they also get as many good things out of it as you have gotten out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Beneath.
You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, visit us at www.c-q.niua.org and follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. The show is conceptualized, hosted, and produced by Punit Gandhi. You can listen to the show on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify. So don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you and stay tuned for the next episode.